Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're talking about what if Led Zeppelin became soundtrack composers. But wait, in the 80s, many of them did, and today's the anniversary of the release of the Death Wish 2 soundtrack that Jimmy Page composed and played on, and he invited some of his friends along too. It was a very good cast of backing musicians. There was Chris Farlow, who did vocal work. There was David Payton on bass. Really, really eclectic mix of music and musicians. And in addition to some of the scored elements that Jimmy Page wrote, there were also some really great songs. The song Who's to Blame, which leads off the album, I consider something of an instant classic. I mean, some of you who have seen the Arms concerts, those charity concerts from the early 80s, will know that both Paul Rodgers and Steve Winwood performed the song with Jimmy Page. They had a concert in London to raise money. And this was when Stevie Winwood accompanied Jimmy Page on this song. And then in the New York concert, Paul Rodgers did the vocals. By this time, they were just about to form The Firm, a supergroup about which I've talked before, featuring Paul Rodgers, Jimmy Page, Chris Slade, and the great fretless bassist Tony Franklin. But the original vocals on the soundtrack are sung by Chris Farlow. You might remember him from Colosseum, the interesting sort of proggy, psychedelic, jazzy band, and he also was for a while in Vincent Crane's Atomic Rooster. Among other things, he had a hit of his own, quite a few hits of his own. You're Out of Time. Being the biggest one, but Who's to Blame is great. City Sirens, another great one that also featured in the Arms concert. And this wasn't the only Led Zeppelin related soundtrack of the 80s. Few years later, Scream for Help was a film that probably isn't widely remembered today, but the soundtrack was all written by John Paul Jones. And there were some great tracks that he would later play when he went out on tour with a band in the late 90s and early 2000s. Really great stuff that you should check out that John Paul Jones did then. But a lot of the music he played came from this soundtrack, and he invited some really famous people. He invited Jimmy Page, so one half of Led Zeppelin. He invited John Anderson of Yes to do some vocal work, and the great soul singer and session singer Madeline Bell. She appeared on this album too. So you should definitely check this out. Now, as I explained in a previous video, the 80s and even the 90s was sort of a golden age for soundtracks featuring pop, rock, and soul musicians. After Saturday Night Fever took the world by storm and brought the soundtrack back, but in a very different way than the best-selling soundtracks of the 40s and 50s, all of the movie studios and filmmakers were rushing to get the biggest pop, rock, and soul stars of the day to create music for their movies. And because of that, the 80s had a huge selection of major hit singles that actually came from soundtracks. Now, Death Wish and Scream for Help didn't really produce mega hits, but they did produce some great music and some great songs. So definitely, if you can get your hands on them, they're kind of rare, but definitely try to check them out because I don't think you'll be disappointed. And if you ever wondered what would happen if Led Zeppelin went Hollywood, well, your questions have been answered. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.